In the misty ridges of Pine Hollow, a widowed mountain woman was about to silence a town that mocked her. What began as a simple trip to the feed store took a shocking turn when Eleanor Ellie Walker found a broken wagon bearing her late husband's initials. She wasn't a typical widow. Years of blacksmithing had hardened her hands and heart. When Ellie rebuilt that wagon, she unknowingly sparked a change that would heal her past, challenge corruption, and forever alter the soul of Pine Hollow. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning fog held Pine Hollow like a secret it wasn't ready to share. It rolled down the slopes of the Blue Ridge Mountains, pressing low against rooftops and fences, cloaking everything in a pale gray veil. The air was thick with the scent of damp pine, coal smoke, and the lingering sweetness of apples left too long in barrels. At the edge of the narrow, rutted road that cut through the heart of town, Eleanor Ellie Walker stood with one gloved hand resting on the worn bridle of her mule. Daisy, the animal's breath rose in visible plumes, ears twitching at the distant clatter of a shop door. Ellie's gaze was fixed on the object, leaning crookedly behind Jenkins' feed store, a wagon so broken, so pitiful, it seemed the earth itself was trying to reclaim it. Its wheels were sunken in the mud. One shattered clean through. The boards were warped and split, bleached by seasons of rain and neglect. A nest of dead vines tangled across its bed. Yet under the ruin, Ellie saw lines of strength, the hint of form that could be restored. Around her, the men of Pine Hollow lingered like shadows, leaning on barrels or porch rails, pretending to talk of crops or coal, while their eyes followed her every move. Walker's finally lost her wits, someone said, spitting a brown stream into the mud. She'll be talking to that wagon next, another added. Laughter followed, low and mean, the kind that rolled easy off tongues grown used to judgment. Ellie didn't turn. She'd heard worse. In Pine Hollow, women who stood alone always drew suspicion, and she had stood alone for years now. The sound of a door opening split the murmurs. Martha Jenkins stepped out from the store, her figure framed by the warm light of the interior. Her grey hair was pulled tight as a rope, her shawl drawn around her shoulders like armor. "Miss Walker," she said, her voice half curious, half condescending. "You surely ain't here for that old wagon, are you?" Ellie met her gaze. "Reckon I am." Martha blinked, clearly expecting a denial. "That heap's been rotten back there since my George hauled it in. Axles bent, wheels busted clean through. Ain't fit for nothing but firewood. Still got good bones," Ellie said softly. The men snickered. One called out, "Maybe she's fixin' to ride it to the moon." Another added, "Ain't no bones left in that thing, nor in her sense." Martha's lips pursed, but curiosity won over mockery. "You're serious, then?" Ellie nodded once. From her coat pocket, she drew a small leather pouch, her savings from years of trading herbs and salves to folks too poor for the doctor. She stepped forward and placed it on the counter inside the shop. $5, she said. "Fair price, I reckon." The room went quiet for a heartbeat. Even the stove's crackle seemed to pause. Martha blinked, then opened the pouch. The coins inside were worn smooth by time, but they were real enough. "Well?" Martha said finally, her tone caught between disbelief and greed. "A fool's money spent same as anyone's." She scribbled out a receipt with slow, deliberate motions, like she was writing down a sin. "You'll need a strong back and a stronger mule to get it home." "I've got both," Ellie replied. Outside, the laughter started again, fainter this time but no less sharp. Ellie ignored it, walking to the wagon's side and running her hand over the cold, wet wood. Daisy brayed softly as Ellie began hitching the harness. The squeal of boots on wood made her glance up. Sheriff Clyde Barrett had stepped out of the general store across the street, his badge catching the thin light. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with a jaw that could have been carved from stone, and eyes too cold to be called blue. "Morning, Mrs. Walker," he called, voice carrying that drawl of false courtesy he used when he wanted an audience. "Heard you made yourself quite a purchase." Ellie kept her hands busy on the harness. "Morning, Sheriff," He took a few steps closer, his boots thudding heavy against the planks. "Can't say I see the sense in throwing money at junk. Folks talk, you know. Wonder what a woman like you wants with a wagon that don't even roll. Reckon it'll roll again soon enough." He smiled then, the kind of smile that looked friendly if you didn't listen to the tone. "Just be careful what you stir up, Ellie. Some folks still remember the last time you got to tinkering." Her fingers froze on the leather strap. She didn't need to ask what he meant. The fire. The one that took Thomas, her husband, and the forge they'd built together. The one Barrett had called an accident. God's will! Ellie looked up at him, her grey eyes steady. "Appreciate your concern, Sheriff," she said evenly. "But this here's my business." His smile flickered, then vanished. He tipped his hat with mock politeness. "Suit yourself. Just remember, out here folks like peace and quiet." He turned and walked away, boots clicking like clockwork. The men followed with their eyes, falling silent under his shadow. Ellie felt the weight of it long after he'd gone. When the last laugh faded, she gave Daisy a soft pat. "Come on, girl," she murmured. "We've work to do." The road home wound up the mountain, narrow and slick from the week's rain. Each step of the mule sent mud sucking at their heels. The wagon groaned behind them, half dead but unwilling to give in. Ellie's shoulders burned, her breath rising in small clouds, but she pressed on. "Every broken thing's got something worth mending," she whispered, more to herself than to the mule. "Just takes the right hands to see it." The forest closed around them, tall pines rising like dark spires against the grey sky. The air grew colder, cleaner. Somewhere in the distance a stream murmured over stones. This mountain had raised her, scolded her, and kept her secrets. Out here, the town's laughter faded to nothing but memory. By the time she reached her clearing, dusk had settled deep, tinting the world in copper and violet. Her cabin stood small but sturdy, smoke curling from its chimney. She unhitched Daisy, gave her a pat and a measure of oats, then turned to the wagon. It sat lopsided in the mud, pitiful and proud all at once. Ellie fetched her lantern, lighting it with practiced hands. The flame danced in the glass, casting a warm halo over the wet wood. She rolled up her sleeves and began to scrape away rust with her knife. The sound, slow, steady, filled the silence. Under her breath, she hummed a tune her husband used to whistle while hammering at the forge. As she worked, she spoke softly, the way one might speak to a child. "You'll be something again, just wait. Maybe not what you were, but something new." The knife struck something different, a patch of wood smoother than the rest. Ellie leaned closer, brushing away the grime. Her breath caught, carved deep into the plank, weathered but unmistakable, were two initials, T.W. Thomas Walker. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The forest stilled, even the wind holding its breath. Ellie ran her fingers over the letters, tracing the grooves left by a hand she knew better than her own. Memories rose. Thomas at the forge, sparks flying as he worked the iron. His laughter echoing in the hollow. The warmth of his hand on her shoulder when the nights turned cold. "You always said we'd build something together," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Maybe this'll be it, even if you ain't here to see." A tear slipped free before she could stop it. She wiped it away with the back of her hand and set her jaw. When the lantern's flame flickered low, she set down her tools and stretched her aching fingers. The wagon loomed before her, half broken still, but less so than before. The first layer of rot was gone, revealing strength beneath. She leaned against the beam and let her eyes close, exhaustion settling over her like a blanket. The mountain hummed softly around her, the rustle of pine needles, the creak of old wood, the distant call of an owl. Down in Pine Hollow, the gossip was already spreading like wildfire. By morning, everyone would know that Eleanor Walker had spent her last savings on a pile of junk, that she'd lost her mind, same as her poor husband before her, that she was out there in the woods, talking to ghosts and building dreams from splinters. But Ellie didn't care, because she'd seen something in that broken wagon that no one else could. The faint shape of hope, hidden beneath ruin, and as the night deepened, wrapping the mountain in silence, she took up her knife again and kept scraping. one stroke at a time. It was not the sound of madness. It was the sound of a woman rebuilding her purpose. One board, one breath, one act of quiet defiance at a time. The lantern's light glowed through the fog. A single flicker of warmth in a world that had long forgotten gentleness. Far below, the church bell tolled the hour. In town, the sheriff slept soundly, his ledger locked away, his conscience buried deeper still. And up on the ridge beneath the whispering pines, Eleanor Walker worked on, her heart steady as the rhythm of her hands. The night had many hours left to go, and so did she. The morning broke with a silver mist over Pine Hollow, seeping between the pines like smoke from a dying fire. Eleanor Ellie Walker rose before the sun, her joints aching from the mountain chill. The wagon sat in the clearing like an old wounded thing, its broken axle sagging to one side, its boards grey with age. Dew had gathered along the frame, glittering faintly in the weak dawn light. She ran a hand over the rough wood, tracing the carved initials, T.W. The memory came unbidden, Thomas's laughter echoing across the yard, the hammer's ring from the forge, the warm smell of iron and sweat and life. Then came the night of smoke and screams, the sheriff's voice afterwards, steady and hollow. "God's will," he'd said. "Fire takes what it must." Ellie's hand clenched. "No, Clyde Barrett," she whispered to the mist. "It takes what men let it." She pushed those thoughts down and went to work. The iron nails she salvaged from Thomas's shop clinked softly in a tin pail. Her hammer, a small one, the handle smoothed by years of use, waited on the step. She set the wagon's broken wheel upright, its rims splintered but still holding shape, and began prying off the damaged spokes one by one. The rhythm soothed her. Work heals what words cannot. From down the road, a crunch of boots broke the quiet. Ellie straightened, squinting through the fog. A tall figure emerged, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, carrying a pack slung across his back. "Jonah Miller. Morning, Miss Ellie," he said, voice soft as the wind through pine needles. She blinked, surprised but not displeased. "Jonah Miller. Ain't seen you since spring thaw. You're taller, I think," he smiled shyly. "Maybe the mountain's shrinking." Ellie chuckled, then nodded toward the wagon. "You here to laugh like the rest?" Jonah shook his head, his expression earnest. "Heard talk in town. Folks say you bought this heap. Figured you might need a hand." Ellie studied him. The boy she'd known was gone. In his place stood a man not yet hardened, but tempered by loss. He'd been Thomas's apprentice once, barely 12 when the fire took the shop. Since then he'd drifted, odd jobs, lumber camps, always somewhere else. "You any good with a wheel still?" she asked. He dropped his pack and knelt beside the wagon, examining the damage. "Depends on the wheel," he said with a grin. "And on whether I get paid in supper or coin." "You'll eat," Ellie said. "If Daisy don't kick you first." They worked in companionable silence. Jonah gathered fallen branches for braces, while Ellie sorted tools from the rusted box near the forge ruins. Every clang of metal stirred ghosts, the forge that once blazed here, Thomas's steady rhythm, his voice calling out for her to bring more water or sand. By midday, they'd stripped the wheel to its rim and begun shaping new spokes from oak. Jonah's strong arms turned the drawknife with practiced grace. Ellie watched him work, the way his jaw tightened when he focused, the sweat tracing paths through the soot on his skin. He caught her gaze once and smiled, and for a brief, guilty heartbeat, she felt warmth stir where she thought only grief remained. When the sun reached its zenith, Jonah wiped his brow and leaned against the wagon. "You really mean to fix this whole thing?" Ellie nodded. "Ain't no sense letting good wood rot. Thomas built things to last. I reckon I can too." He looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "You're the only one in town still talking about building. Everyone else just gets by. Getting by ain't living," she replied. "This wagon's gonna move again. Carry something worth hauling, not gossip or grain, but help." Jonah frowned slightly. "Help?" "Medicine," she said. "For folks too far gone or too poor for Dr. Cole to see. Babies burning with fever, old bones aching through winter. I know what grows in these hills better than any man with a city degree." Jonah's eyes softened. "That's a fine thing, Miss Ellie. Reckon the town'll see it that way?" "Don't matter if they don't," she said. Right's right, whether folks cheer it or spit on it. They returned to work, their words fading into the rhythm of hammers and saws. By evening, the first wheel stood proud again, its rim gleaming faintly with new iron. Jonah grinned, pride lighting his face. "Look at that! She'll roll yet!" Ellie nodded, though her gaze lingered on the distant hills. Smoke curled from the town below. Somewhere down there, laughter carried faintly, mean laughter. She knew whose it was. The next day brought trouble. Jonah came down to town for supplies, nails, tar, and the new spoke wrench, and found Sheriff Clyde Barrett leaning against the rail outside Jenkins' feed store, talking to Martha Jenkins herself. Both turned when they saw him. "Well, if it ain't Thomas Walker's old boy," Clyde drawled, his voice smooth but sharp beneath. "Heard you been spending your hours up on that ridge with Mrs. Walker." Jonah set down his sack. "Just lending a hand, Sheriff." "She's fixing her wagon," Martha sniffed, her lips curling. "Fixing? Ha! More like conjuring. You know how she is, always messing with herbs and roots, talking to that mule like it's human." Clyde chuckled low. "A man ought to be careful keeping such company. Folks might start saying he's bewitched." Jonah's jaw tightened. "Ain't nothing bewitching about kindness. She's just trying to build something." "Kindness," Clyde repeated, tasting the word like it was bitter. "Is that what you call it?" He stepped closer, his polished boots gleaming, his badge catching the light. "Listen, son, women like Eleanor Walker, they stir trouble. Start making folks question the order of things. Next thing you know, they're thinking they don't need the law or the good Lord." Jonah met his gaze. "Maybe they just need someone who ain't afraid of helping them." Clyde's smile thinned. "Watch yourself, boy." He turned away, tipping his hat to Martha, who smirked behind her hand. As Jonah walked off, he heard her mutter, "Just like his master, too proud for his own good." Jonah's fists clenched around the sack. He said nothing, but the fire in his chest burned all the way up the mountain. When he reached Ellie's cabin, the first thing he saw was her standing by the forge ruins, holding a small piece of charred iron in her hand. "What's that?" he asked. She turned it over slowly. "Found it buried in the old ash pit. Thought it was part of the wagon brace at first, but—" She wiped the soot away with her thumb. Faintly etched into the metal was a mark. C.B. Jonah frowned. "Clyde Barrett." "Aye," she whispered. "Thomas said once the sheriff brought down some government iron for bridge work. Said it was poor metal, brittle. I told him not to use it, but he did, 'cause Clyde pressed him to. Said it'd keep the town contracts running." Her voice wavered. "That was the week before the fire." Jonah looked at the metal, his throat tight. "You think?" "I think," she said quietly, "that maybe that fire wasn't no accident." The words hung between them, heavy as thunderclouds. Over the next days, they worked faster, as though motion could drown out memory. The wagon began to take shape. New planks, fresh iron rims, the smell of pine pitch thick in the air. Ellie's hands blistered and bled, but she never stopped. Jonah built a new axle from oak, stronger than the last, and Ellie painted the boards a soft forest green. Each nail driven was a prayer, each stroke of the brush a defiance. But Pine Hollow's eyes were sharp. When Ellie came to town for linseed oil, whispers followed her through every aisle. There she is, the witch woman, trying to raise her husband's ghost. Lord have mercy. She'll bring a curse on us all. Ellie ignored them, head high. But their voices bit deep. Martha Jenkins watched her from behind the counter, lips pursed. "You ought to quit while you still got folks willing to sell to you, Miss Walker. Ain't good to tempt tongues." Ellie met her gaze. "Ain't tongues I'm worried about, Mrs. Jenkins. Its heart's gone cold." Martha flushed but said nothing. When Ellie stepped outside, the sheriff was waiting again. "Afternoon, Miss Walker," Clyde said, tipping his hat. "Heard you've been keeping busy. Can't say folks don't notice." Ellie didn't slow. "I don't do it for notice." He stepped into her path. "Then why do it at all? Wagon like that, what's it for?" "Medicine," she said simply. "For those needing it." Clyde's smile faltered. "Medicine? You ain't no doctor." And up on the ridge beneath the whispering pines, Eleanor Walker worked on, her heart steady as the rhythm of her hands. The night had many hours left to go, and so did she. The morning broke with a silver mist over Pine Hollow, seeping between the pines like smoke from a dying fire. Eleanor Ellie Walker rose before the sun, her joints aching from the mountain chill. The wagon sat in the clearing like an old wounded thing, its broken axle sagging to one side, its boards grey with age. Dew had gathered along the frame, glittering faintly in the weak dawn light. She ran a hand over the rough wood, tracing the carved initials, T.W. The memory came unbidden, Thomas's laughter echoing across the yard, the hammer's ring from the forge, the warm smell of iron and sweat and life. Then came the night of smoke and screams, the sheriff's voice afterwards, steady and hollow. "God's will," he'd said. "Fire takes what it must." Ellie's hand clenched. "No, Clyde Barrett," she whispered to the mist. "It takes what men let it." She pushed those thoughts down and went to work. The iron nails she salvaged from Thomas's shop clinked softly in a tin pail. Her hammer, a small one, the handle smoothed by years of use, waited on the step. She set the wagon's broken wheel upright, its rim splintered but still holding shape, and began prying off the damaged spokes one by one. The rhythm soothed her. Work heals what words cannot. From down the road, a crunch of boots broke the quiet. Ellie straightened, squinting through the fog. A tall figure emerged, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, carrying a pack slung across his back. "Jonah Miller." "Morning, Miss Ellie," he said, voice soft as the wind through pine needles. She blinked, surprised but not displeased. "Jonah Miller. Ain't seen you since spring thaw." "You're taller, I think," he smiled shyly. "Maybe the mountain's shrinking." Ellie chuckled, then nodded toward the wagon. "You here to laugh like the rest?" Jonah shook his head, his expression earnest. "Heard talk in town. Folks say you bought this heap. Figured you might need a hand." Ellie studied him. The boy she'd known was gone. In his place stood a man not yet hardened, but tempered by loss. He'd been Thomas's apprentice once, barely 12 when the fire took the shop. Since then he'd drifted, odd jobs, lumber camps, always somewhere else. "You any good with a wheel still?" she asked. He dropped his pack and knelt beside the wagon, examining the damage. "Depends on the wheel," he said with a grin. "And on whether I get paid in supper or coin." "You'll eat," Ellie said. "If Daisy don't kick you first." They worked in companionable silence. Jonah gathered fallen branches for braces, while Ellie sorted tools from the rusted box near the forge ruins. Every clang of metal stirred ghosts, the forge that once blazed here, Thomas's steady rhythm, his voice calling out for her to bring more water or sand. By midday, they'd stripped the wheel to its rim and begun shaping new spokes from oak. Jonah's strong arms turned the drawknife with practiced grace. Ellie watched him work, the way his jaw tightened when he focused, the sweat tracing paths through the soot on his skin. He caught her gaze once and smiled, and for a brief, guilty heartbeat, she felt warmth stir where she thought only grief remained. When the sun reached its zenith, Jonah wiped his brow and leaned against the wagon. "You really mean to fix this whole thing?" Ellie nodded. "Ain't no sense letting good wood rot. Thomas built things to last. I reckon I can too." He looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "You're the only one in town still talking about building. Everyone else just gets by. Getting by ain't living," she replied. "This wagon's gonna move again. Carry something worth hauling, not gossip or grain, but help." Jonah frowned slightly. "Help?" "Medicine," she said. "For folks too far gone or too poor for Dr. Cole to see. Babies burning with fever, old bones aching through winter. I know what grows in these hills better than any man with a city degree." Jonah's eyes softened. "That's a fine thing, Miss Ellie. Reckon the town'll see it that way?" "Don't matter if they don't," she said. "Right's right whether folks cheer it or spit on it." They returned to work, their words fading into the rhythm of hammers and saws. By evening, the first wheel stood proud again, its rim gleaming faintly with new iron. Jonah grinned, pride lighting his face. "Look at that. She'll roll yet." Ellie nodded, though her gaze lingered on the distant hills. Smoke curled from the town below. Somewhere down there, laughter carried faintly, mean laughter. She knew whose it was. The next day brought trouble. Jonah came down to town for supplies, nails, tar, and a new spoke wrench, and found Sheriff Clyde Barrett leaning against the rail outside Jenkins' feed store, talking to Martha Jenkins herself. Both turned when they saw him. "Well, if it ain't Thomas Walker's old boy," Clyde drawled, his voice smooth but sharp beneath. "Heard you've been spending your hours up on that ridge with Mrs. Walker." Jonah set down his sack. "Just lending a hand, Sheriff." "She's fixing her wagon," Martha sniffed, her lips curling. "Fixing? Ha! More like conjuring. You know how she is, always messing with herbs and roots, talking to that mule like it's human." Clyde chuckled low. "A man ought to be careful keeping such company. Folks might start saying he's bewitched." Jonah's jaw tightened. "Ain't nothing bewitching about kindness. She's just trying to build something." "Kindness," Clyde repeated, tasting the word like it was bitter. "That what you call it?" He stepped closer, his polished boots gleaming, his badge catching the light. "Listen, son, women like Eleanor Walker, they stir trouble. Start making folks question the order of things. Next thing you know, they're thinking they don't need the law or the good Lord." Jonah met his gaze. "Maybe they just need someone who ain't afraid of helping them." Clyde's smile thinned. "Watch yourself, boy." He turned away, tipping his hat to Martha, who smirked behind her hand. As Jonah walked off, he heard her mutter, "Just like his master, too proud for his own good." Jonah's fists clenched around the sack. He said nothing, but the fire in his chest burned all the way up the mountain. When he reached Ellie's cabin, the first thing he saw was her standing by the forge ruins, holding a small piece of charred iron in her hand. "What's that?" he asked. She turned it over slowly. "Found it buried in the old ash pit. Thought it was part of the wagon brace at first, but—" She wiped the soot away with her thumb. Faintly etched into the metal was a mark. C.B. Jonah frowned. "Clyde Barrett." "Aye," she whispered. "Thomas said once the sheriff brought down some government iron for bridge work, said it was poor metal, brittle. I told him not to use it, but he did, 'cause Clyde pressed him to. Said it'd keep the town contracts running." Her voice wavered. "That was the week before the fire." Jonah looked at the metal, his throat tight. "You think?" "I think," she said quietly, "that maybe that fire wasn't no accident." The words hung between them, heavy as thunderclouds. Over the next days, they worked faster, as though motion could drown out memory. The wagon began to take shape. New planks, fresh iron rims, the smell of pine pitch thick in the air. Ellie's hands blistered and bled, but she never stopped. Jonah built a new axle from oak, stronger than the last, and Ellie painted the boards a soft forest green. Each nail driven was a prayer, each stroke of the brush a defiance. But Pine Hollow's eyes were sharp. When Ellie came to town for linseed oil, whispers followed her through every aisle. There she is, the witch woman, trying to raise her husband's ghost. Lord have mercy. She'll bring a curse on us all. Ellie ignored them, head high. But their voices bit deep. Martha Jenkins watched her from behind the counter, lips pursed. "You ought to quit while you still got folks willing to sell to you, Miss Walker. Ain't good to tempt tongues." Ellie met her gaze. "Ain't tongues I'm worried about, Mrs. Jenkins. Its heart's gone cold." Martha flushed but said nothing. When Ellie stepped outside, the sheriff was waiting again. "Afternoon, Miss Walker," Clyde said, tipping his hat. "Heard you've been keeping busy. Can't say folks don't notice." Ellie didn't slow. "I don't do it for notice." He stepped into her path. "Then why do it at all? Wagon like that, what's it for?" "Medicine," she said simply. "For those needing it." Clyde's smile faltered. "Medicine? You ain't no doctor." "I don't claim to be, but the Lord put healing in the earth same as he put law in your badge." His eyes hardened. "Careful, Eleanor. You start acting like you're above the law, you'll find yourself beneath it soon enough." She held his gaze, unflinching. "Funny thing about truth, Sheriff. It don't stay buried long." He tilted his hat again, but there was no warmth in the gesture. "Just remember, this town don't take kindly to troublemakers, especially ones who forget their place." Ellie watched him walk away, her heart hammering. Beneath the calm, fear whispered. But so did something else. Resolve. That night she lit her lantern and sat by the wagon's side. The wood gleamed softly in the flicker of flame. Jonah had gone home hours ago, but his hammer still rested where he left it. Ellie reached for it, tracing the worn handle. Then she looked toward the horizon, where the faint glow of the town still shimmered. "They can whisper all they want," she murmured. "This wagon'll roll again, and when it does, It'll carry something this town's forgotten. Mercy. A gust of wind stirred the trees, scattering pine needles across the ground. The flame danced, casting long shadows. In the distance, thunder grumbled, a storm brewing somewhere beyond the ridges. Ellie smiled faintly. Let it come. She set her hammer down, the sound echoing softly across the clearing. The night settled around her, heavy and alive. Beneath the earth, in the cold ashes of her husband's forge, something deeper than grief began to glow. An ember of truth, of purpose, waiting for the right breath to ignite it, and high above, beyond the reach of rumor or law, the mountains watched in silence. The storm arrived just past midnight. It began with a whisper through the trees, wind sighing like a warning, and then came the downpour, slamming against the roof in sheets of silver. Eleanor Walker stood at her window, lantern in hand, watching lightning fork across the ridge. For a moment, the flash revealed her wagon below, glistening with rain, every drop running down its fresh green boards like tears. "Hold fast," she murmured. Thunder cracked so close it rattled the glass. She set the lantern down and crossed herself out of old habit, though her faith these days lived more in the soil than the sermons. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The door burst open. Jonah stumbled in, soaked to the bone, his hair plastered to his forehead. "Ellie," he shouted over the roar. "The creek's risen, bridge is near gone. If it breaks, it'll flood the south road." Her eyes widened. "Lord above!" Without a second thought, she snatched her shawl and headed for the door. "Wait," Jonah said, catching her arm. "You can't go out in that." "Can't sit here neither," she said firmly. "There's families down that road. The tailor's place sits low. They'll be trapped if the bridge goes." He saw the steel in her eyes and knew there was no stopping her. "Then I'm coming too." Together they plunged into the storm. The night was chaos, rain hammering their faces, wind howling through the trees like wild spirits. Their boots sank into the mud as they followed the narrow track toward the creek. The lantern's flame guttered, then went out, leaving only the jagged flashes of lightning to guide them. By the time they reached the crossing, the water had risen halfway up the planks. The bridge swayed under the force, one support beam already cracking. Jonah grabbed a rope from his belt, looping it around the nearest oak. "We can brace it, buy him some time to get across." Ellie nodded, wading into the freezing current. The rope burned against her hands as they pulled it tight, securing the beam. Her breath came in gasps. The cold bit into her bones. "Jonah!" she shouted, but her voice was lost in the storm. A flash of light, and then the world split open with a crack. The bridge gave way, splintering apart. Jonah lunged, grabbing Ellie's arm just as the current tore through. They tumbled into the water, the rope snapping free. The river swallowed them whole. The current dragged them downstream, smashing them against rocks and roots. Ellie's lungs screamed for air. She clawed upward, breaking the surface long enough to gasp before being pulled under again. Jonah's hand found hers, rough, strong, refusing to let go. Finally, they slammed against a fallen log, clinging tight until the water's fury eased. Gasping, bruised and shaking, they pulled themselves onto the muddy bank. Jonah lay on his back, chest heaving. "You all right?" Ellie coughed, spitting out river water. "Still breathing. Reckon that's enough for now?" They laughed weakly, half relief, half disbelief, before falling silent. The rain had begun to ease, turning from rage to steady sorrow. From across the creek, a lantern light bobbed through the darkness. A voice called out, Mr. Taylor, shouting for his children. Ellie tried to stand, but her ankle gave out. Jonah caught her. "You're hurt." "Sprained, maybe," she said, grimacing. "Help me up." He hesitated, then nodded, slinging her arm over his shoulder. They limped up the path toward higher ground. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving the valley drowned in silence. The creek was a swollen serpent now, glinting cold and cruel under the pale morning light. The bridge was gone. So were half the Taylors' fences and their grain shed, but their house still stood. Ellie had never been so grateful for the stubborn strength of mountain wood. The Taylors came out when they saw her limping up the hill. "Miss Walker, Lord have mercy, we thought the bridge took you. It nearly did, she said with a tired smile. But it'll take more'n a bit of water to keep me down. Mrs. Taylor clasped her hands. You saved us. That rope held long enough for the children to cross. We owe you our lives, Ellie shook her head. Don't owe me nothing. Just keep warm and dry. Jonah stood behind her, soaked and silent, watching the family reunite. His gaze drifted to Ellie, her soaked hair clinging to her face. Her eyes bright, despite the exhaustion. For the first time in years, he felt something fierce and alive rise in his chest. Hope. But in Pine Hollow, hope was a dangerous thing. When Ellie returned to town 3 days later, ankle-wrapped, face pale from fatigue, the gossip had already spread faster than the floodwater. She was out there in the storm, someone whispered at the general store. Casting spells on the creek, another muttered. Trying to raise her husband's ghost, most likely. Ellie ignored them, but her jaw tightened. When she stepped inside to buy flour, Martha Jenkins leaned across the counter, her voice sweet as spoiled honey. Back from your little midnight rituals, Miss Walker. Sheriff Barrett's been asking after you. Wants to know what business you had out by the bridge. Ellie's patience cracked. My business was saving the Taylors' lives, not sitting in town trading lies. The store went quiet. Martha flushed, but before she could retort, a shadow filled the doorway. Sheriff Barrett himself. Well now, he said smoothly, ain't that something? Folks say you near drowned yourself out there, Mrs. Walker. Can't imagine why a widow would risk her neck for other people's fences. Ellie turned to face him square. Because I still got a soul, Sheriff. Can you say the same? A murmur rippled through the store. Clyde's smile didn't falter, but his eyes went cold. Careful, Eleanor. You talk like that, and folks might start believing those witch tales. She stepped closer, her voice steady. If speaking truth makes me a witch, then maybe this town could use a few more. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. Then she turned, paid for her flour, and walked out without another word. Clyde watched her go, his jaw tight. When she disappeared down the street, he spat the word under his breath. Troublemaker. Back at the cabin, Ellie found Jonah mending the wagon's yoke. He looked up, concern flashing across his face. What did he say? She sighed. The sheriff's a fool dressed in law. He wants me quiet, Jonah frowned. You think he had something to do with that fire, don't you? Ellie hesitated, then nodded. I can't prove it yet, but I'll find a way. He stared at her a long moment. Then I'll help. She looked at him sharply. Jonah, I ain't letting him bury the truth. Thomas taught me more than how to swing a hammer. He taught me right from wrong. Ellie's throat tightened. You're too young to pick a fight with men like Barrett. Maybe, but I'm old enough to see what he's done to this town. She studied him, the earnest fire in his eyes, the quiet strength in his voice, and felt the first flicker of something dangerous, trust. Then we do this careful, she said finally. We find proof. Not rumor, proof, Jonah nodded. Where do we start? Her gaze drifted toward the ridge, where the ruins of Thomas's forge lay buried in moss and memory. With the fire, that night they dug through the ashes. The air was still, the moon half hidden behind clouds. Their shovels struck old stone, then cinders, then the blackened remains of iron tools. Over here, Jonah said, kneeling beside a charred beam. He brushed away dirt, revealing something metallic wedged beneath, a bolt warped and fused to its bracket. Ellie held the lantern close. The metal shimmered faintly where the soot flaked off. See that shine? That's no ordinary iron, it's alloy. Soft under heat, Jonah frowned. Like the kind Barrett sold? Aye, she said grimly. Cheap stuff meant for show, not strength. Thomas would have known better, but Barrett pushed it on him. Claimed it had earned the shop more contracts. Jonah's jaw set. Then he knew it'd fail. Maybe not at first, Ellie said quietly. But he knew once the fire started, no one would question a faulty forge, just a poor man's mistake. They worked until dawn, pulling fragments from the ash, melted tools, twisted nails, blackened bolts stamped with CB. By the time the sun rose, they had a small pile of evidence and a larger one of rage. Jonah wiped his hands on his trousers. This is enough to show Dr. Cole, maybe. He's got a mind for proof, Ellie nodded slowly. And maybe enough to show the town who really set that fire. But even as she said it, she knew Barrett wouldn't go down easy. Men like him didn't yield to truth. They buried it. The next week brought whispers, warnings, and one quiet night that changed everything. Jonah had gone into town to fetch nails. He didn't return by sundown. Ellie waited, pacing the porch, the lantern's flame trembling with every gust of wind. When the first owl called, dread coiled in her gut. By midnight she saddled Daisy and rode down the mountain. The town lay still under a pale moon. Then from behind the jailhouse she heard voices. "Boy thought he could dig where he ain't got business," said one. "Sheriff said keep him till morning. Maybe he'll remember his manners then," replied another. Ellie's blood went cold. She crept closer, peering through the slats of the holding pen. Jonah sat inside, face bruised, wrists bound. Clyde Barrett stood nearby, cleaning his revolver with slow precision. "You got fire in you, Miller?" Clyde drawled. "Shame it's wasted on a dead man's widow. Tell me, what's she paying you with? Coin or comfort?" Jonah's glare burned hotter than any forge. "You're a coward hiding behind a badge." Clyde's hand moved faster than thought. The gun butt struck Jonah's jaw, sending him sprawling. Ellie bit back a cry. The sheriff leaned down, voice low. "You tell that woman to quit her digging. Next time, I won't be so gentle." He turned and strode inside, the door slamming behind him. Ellie waited until the guards wandered off, then slipped to the pen. "Jonah," she whispered. His head lifted weakly. "Ellie, what are you—" "Quiet," she hissed, pulling a small pick from her shawl. "Hold still." It took a minute, maybe two, but the lock clicked open. She caught his arm as he staggered out. "We ain't got long," she said. "Can you walk?" He nodded, teeth gritted. Together they slipped through the alley and into the woods. They didn't stop until the jail lights were specks behind them. When they reached the ridge, Jonah collapsed against a tree, breath ragged. "He'll come for us." Ellie looked toward the horizon, where the first faint glow of dawn touched the peaks. Her face was calm, but her voice carried steel. "Let him come. This time he'll find more than ashes waitin'." As the sun rose over Pine Hollow, the wagon stood ready, paint gleaming, wheels steady, its yoke repaired. But now it bore something new, a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards, packed with the evidence they'd found. Ellie ran her hand along the wood, her reflection faint in the varnish. "This wagon's more than medicine now," she said softly. "It's truth on wheels." Jonah looked at her, bruised but resolute. "Then let's roll it straight through his lies." The morning air smelled of pine and smoke, the scent of both endings and beginnings. And as they hitched Daisy to the wagon, the wind stirred the ashes by the forge one last time, sending a thin trail of grey rising toward the light. Somewhere in that whisper of smoke, it almost sounded like Thomas's voice, low and proud. "Keep building, Ellie. Fire can't burn what's made of will." She smiled faintly, eyes glistening. "I love." "It surely can't." And with that, she climbed onto the wagon seat beside Jonah. The wheels creaked once, then rolled forward, slow at first, then steady as a heartbeat, carrying them down the mountain road toward Pine Hollow. The storm had passed, but the reckoning had just begun. The wagon rolled into Pine Hollow at first light, its wheels crunching over frost-stiff earth. The town still slept beneath a veil of mist, chimneys smoking lazy threads into the cold air. Eleanor Walker sat tall on the driver's bench, shawl drawn tight, her eyes fixed on the sheriff's office at the far end of Main Street. Jonah rode beside her, jaw still bruised, one hand resting near the hammer of his father's old rifle. No words passed between them. None were needed. They reached the square just as the sun crested the ridge, flooding the street with pale gold. It struck the wagon's new paint, making it shine like a banner. Martha Jenkins was the first to notice. She stood outside her store, broom in hand, her jaw dropping. "Mercy on us," she whispered. "She's back with that fool wagon." A few more townsfolk drifted out, blinking in the light. Within minutes, a small crowd had gathered. Whispers fluttered like startled birds. "She brought that boy with her. Didn't the sheriff throw him in jail?" "Looks like trouble's come calling." Ellie climbed down, boots steady on the cobblestones. "That's right," she said, loud enough for all to hear. "Trouble's come, and it wears a badge." A ripple of shock went through the onlookers. Martha gasped. "Miss Walker, that's a dangerous thing to say, only if it ain't true," Ellie replied. Before anyone could answer, the door of the sheriff's office swung open. Clyde Barrett stepped out, freshly shaven, hat tipped just so, the image of a man who thought the world belonged to him. "Well, well," he said, his smile sharp as a blade. "Look who's rolled back into town. I thought I told you to keep quiet, Miss Walker." "You told me a lot of things," Ellie said evenly. "Didn't mean I was listening." Jonah dropped from the wagon and opened the rear latch. From inside, he pulled a small crate, its lid nailed tight. He set it on the ground between them. Clyde's gaze flicked to it. "What's that?" "Proof," Ellie said, "of what really burned my husband's shop." The sheriff's expression didn't change, but a faint tick pulsed in his jaw. "You're treading on thin ice, Widow Walker. Then I reckon I'll dance careful." Jonah pried the crate open. Inside lay the charred metal pieces they'd dug from the forge. The warped bolts, the melted brackets, each stamped CB. Ellie held one up. "Recognize that mark, Sheriff? It's your initials, your alloy, the same you sold Thomas Walker, cheap and faulty." Clyde's voice dropped to a low growl. "That's slander." "No," Ellie said, stepping forward. "It's truth. You gave him this metal knowing it couldn't hold. You told him it'd make him rich. When the fire came, you blamed him. You called it God's will. But you knew, didn't you? You knew exactly what you'd done." For a heartbeat, silence ruled the square. Then Martha Jenkins spoke. "She's lying. Eleanor Walker's been touched in the head ever since her man died." "You all know it?" Ellie turned, her eyes hard as flint. "You've been saying that for years, Martha. Tell me, did it make you feel taller, standing on another woman's grief?" The crowd stirred. Some shifted uneasily. Others looked at the wagon, the crate, the broken pieces of proof glinting in the sun. Jonah lifted another fragment. "I found these myself, same place the fire started. Ask Dr. Cole. He'll tell you what kind of metal it is." Someone from the back shouted, "Where's the doctor then?" "Right here." The voice came from the end of the street. Dr. Samuel Cole, tall and solemn, stepped forward, spectacles glinting. He carried a small leather satchel. "I've seen the evidence," he said. "Mrs. Walker and the boy brought it to me yesterday. The alloy's brittle, melts at half the temperature it should. No blacksmith worth his salt would have used it. Whoever sold it did so knowingly or foolishly." Clyde's smile faltered. "You're overstepping, Doctor." Cole met his gaze. "Maybe, but you overstepped first, Sheriff." The crowd began to murmur. Suspicion turned like a tide. Clyde's hand drifted toward his revolver. "You best all calm down before someone gets hurt." Jonah tensed, stepping between him and Ellie. "You ain't shooting no one today. Step aside." "Boy!" the sheriff warned. Ellie's voice cut through the rising chaos. "You'd draw a gun on the truth, Clyde. Go on then. Let Pine Hollow see the kind of man they've been following." The sheriff froze. His hand hovered near the holster, but the crowd was watching now. Every eye sharp, every whisper turning against him. Martha's broom clattered to the ground. "Clyde," she said softly, fear creeping into her tone. "Just let it be." But Barrett couldn't let it be. He'd built his life on control, fear, silence, respect bought by intimidation. And now, in front of everyone, a widow and a blacksmith's apprentice had stripped that power bare. "You think they'll believe you?" he hissed. "You're just a woman with ghosts and a wagon full of scrap." Ellie took another step forward. "Then maybe it's time this town learned ghosts can speak." She reached into the wagon again and pulled out a small, leather-bound book. Thomas's ledger, the one she'd found hidden beneath the false floor of the wagon a week ago. She flipped it open and read aloud, "October 3rd, sold 3 horseshoes made from Barrett alloy. Broke under heat. Told Clyde to take 'em back to the supplier. He said not to worry. Said the town will forget one day's mistake." A wave of voices rose from the crowd. Shock, disbelief, anger. Ellie raised her voice above them all. "You called him careless. You let the fire take him, and you called it God's will. But God didn't light that match. You did." Clyde's face darkened. "That's enough!" He lunged, hand flashing toward his revolver, but Jonah was faster. He swung the rifle up, barrel leveled at the sheriff's chest. "Don't," Jonah warned, voice shaking but firm. Clyde froze, fingers inches from his gun. For a long moment, the square held its breath. Then slowly he straightened, raising his hands. "You'll regret this, boy," he said coldly. "Maybe," Jonah replied. "But not as much as you will." Dr. Cole stepped forward, voice clear. "Sheriff Barrett, I'm placing you under arrest for negligence and obstruction of justice. I'll be telegraphing the county marshal myself." The sheriff's eyes flicked between them, Ellie, Jonah, the doctor, and the crowd that no longer looked at him with respect, but with disgust. For the first time in years, Clyde Barrett had no one to command. When two townsmen moved forward to take his arms, he didn't fight. He just spat into the dust and muttered, "You'll all be sorry when the law gets here." But no one answered. As they dragged him toward the jailhouse, Martha Jenkins finally found her voice. "Well, I'll be damned," she whispered. Ellie turned to her, exhausted but steady. "No, Martha. You'll just have to live in a town that's finally seen the truth." The days that followed felt like the slow lifting of a curse. Barrett was gone by week's end, escorted to the county seat in irons. Rumors swirled about a trial, a confession, even a federal inquiry into the misuse of county funds. Pine Hollow buzzed with gossip, but for once, none of it was aimed at Eleanor Walker. The wagon became a symbol. Folks stopped by her cabin offering repairs, tools, even food. Dr. Cole said the town owed her more than thanks. Jonah went back to the forge, rebuilding it piece by piece with her help. One evening, as the sun bled gold over the ridges, Ellie sat by the wagon, sanding the last of its edges smooth. Jonah joined her, wiping soot from his hands. "You think they'll ever forget what he did?" he asked quietly. She shook her head. "No, but maybe they'll remember what we did instead." He smiled faintly. "You could leave, you know. Take the wagon down the valley, start over. Nobody'd blame you." Ellie ran her fingers along the wagon's side, tracing the faint initials carved beneath the varnish. T.W. "This is where we built our life," she said softly. "Where it ended and where it began again. I reckon I'll stay a while longer." Jonah nodded. "Then so will I." They sat in silence, the forest humming with the quiet music of crickets and wind. Autumn deepened into winter. Snow dusted the rooftops, and Pine Hollow began to change in small, tender ways. The gossip quieted. The laughter in the saloon softened. Even Martha Jenkins started offering free biscuits to travelers. Ellie's wagon found new purpose. Once a relic of grief, it became a healing wagon, filled not just with herbs, but with warmth. Blankets and letters she carried between distant farms. One morning, as she hitched Daisy for another trip, she found a folded note pinned to the door. "Miss Walker, if you ever come by the county courthouse, you might want to be present when Sheriff Barrett's trial starts. Some men still think fire can cover their sins. I reckon they're about to learn otherwise." Ellie folded the letter and slipped it into her pocket. She looked toward the horizon, where the mountains met the sky. "Come on, Daisy," she said. "We've got one more road to ride." The courthouse was 3 days' journey down the valley. When Ellie arrived, the crowd was larger than any she'd seen since the harvest fair. Inside, the air was thick with tobacco smoke and tension. Clyde Barrett sat at the defendant's table, hair neatly combed, uniform stripped of its badge. His eyes found hers the moment she entered. "Well, if it ain't the Mountain Witch," he sneered. Ellie met his gaze without flinching. "Funny thing, Clyde, witches get burned, but they don't stay gone. Fire just makes them stronger." He scowled, looking away. The judge called the court to order. Dr. Cole took the stand first, explaining the science of the alloy. Then Jonah spoke, recounting the night he was beaten and jailed. Finally, Ellie stood. Her testimony was quiet, steady, and true. She spoke of Thomas, his laughter, his skill, his faith in hard work. She spoke of the night she watched his forge burn, of the ashes she sifted through for years, searching for meaning. And then she held up the ledger. "This is what he left behind," she said. "Not riches, not land, just truth. Truth's all a good man's got in this world, and it's all a bad man fears." The courtroom fell silent. Even Barrett didn't move. When the verdict came, it was short and final, guilty of criminal negligence and fraud. As the guards led him away, Barrett turned to her, eyes blazing. "You think you've won, Ellie Walker? You'll never change this place." She watched him go, her voice calm. Didn't aim to change the place, Clyde, just the people who live in it. When Ellie returned to Pine Hollow weeks later, snow blanketed the ridge like a blessing. Jonah met her at the gate, a grin spreading across his face. "Welcome home," he said. She smiled, climbing down from the wagon. "Feels lighter somehow." He nodded toward the wagon. "Maybe because it ain't carrying ghosts anymore." Ellie looked at it. The same wagon the town once mocked, the same one that carried her pain, her proof, her purpose. She reached out, brushing frost from its side. "No," she said softly. "Just stories now." "And stories are meant to be carried," Jonah chuckled. "Then where to next?" She looked out over the valley, where smoke rose from quiet homes, where laughter drifted faintly through the cold air. "Wherever folks have forgotten how to believe in what's right," she said. "We'll remind 'em." And as the sun rose over Pine Hollow, casting gold across the snow, the wagon creaked forward once more, steady, sure, and unbroken. Not a relic, not a ghost, but a promise made of wood, fire, and will. The dawn came quiet that morning, softer than it had in years. Pine Hollow lay under a blanket of mist, the kind that blurred edges and softened even the harshest memories. Down the ridge, smoke curled from Ellie Walker's chimney, and for once, it wasn't the black, choking kind that haunted her dreams. It was clean, steady, alive. The wagon stood in the clearing, gleaming faintly in the pale light. No longer broken, no longer forgotten. Its boards were sanded smooth and treated with oil until they shone like honeyed oak. The wheels, rebuilt from the remnants of the old mill axle, turned without a creak. But what caught the eye most was the carving across its side, Walker and Son Forge, reborn by her hands. Ellie ran her fingers over the letters, tracing the grooves one last time before she hitched Daisy to the front. The old mule pawed at the dirt impatiently, as if she too knew this trip was different. For months Ellie had worked, through gossip, rain, and loneliness, turning the wagon from a symbol of mockery into something sacred. This morning, she'd finally ride it into town. The path was familiar, yet it felt new beneath her boots. Dew soaked her hem, and birds called from the treetops, their songs brighter than she remembered. Every sound, the creak of leather, the rhythm of Daisy's hooves, seemed to mark a heartbeat. A steady march toward something long overdue. Halfway down the trail, Ellie slowed, letting the forest breathe around her. She glanced toward the grove, where Thomas had once built their first forge, a small shed long since reclaimed by vines. For years, she couldn't look at it without pain. Now the ache was softer, almost tender. "You'd laugh, wouldn't you, Tom?" she whispered, "saying I went and built it all wrong. But I reckon you'd still be proud." A wind stirred, carrying the scent of pine and iron. To Ellie, it felt like an answer. When she reached town, heads turned. The clang of her wagon wheels against the wooden bridge drew eyes from porches and shop windows alike. Children ran to the roadside, gawking. Men paused mid-conversation, their laughter faltering. Even Martha Jenkins, posted as always at her doorway, with her shawl tight across her chest, froze mid-scowl. That broken heap of wood they'd all mocked now rolled smooth and silent, its new iron fittings glinting in the sunlight. The forge emblem on its side caught the morning light, and even from a distance they could read the name. Walker and Son Ellie pulled to a stop right in front of Jenkins' feed store, the same place where it all began. "Morning, Martha," she said evenly, stepping down. "Told you it had good bones?" For once, Martha said nothing. Her mouth opened, then shut again, words failing her as the townsfolk gathered around. Sheriff Clyde Barrett emerged from across the street, his thumbs hooked in his belt. "Well, I'll be," he muttered, crossing over. "Didn't think I'd live to see that old ghost moving again." Ellie gave a small smile. "Guess some ghosts just need the right hands." The sheriff circled the wagon, inspecting every bolt and beam. He tapped one of the new wheels with his boot. "Fine work. You do all this yourself?" "With what I had left. And a bit of what the mountain gave me." His expression softened, though his pride wouldn't let him show it for long. "Town's been talking," he admitted. "Word is you've been building a forge again up there." "Word travels fast when folks got nothing else to do," Ellie said, not unkindly. "But yes, figure Pine Hollow could use one again." Farmers need tools, miners need repairs. Can't wait forever on shipments from downriver." A murmur spread through the onlookers. The practicality of it was undeniable. Even Martha's calculating eyes darted to the sturdy metalwork along the wagon's frame, as though tallying its worth in her head. "Reckon folks might pay fair for your work," Sheriff Barrett said. Ellie met his gaze, steady and unflinching. "I ain't asking for favors. Just wanting to build again." He nodded slowly. "Ain't nothing wrong with that." By noon the crowd had thinned. Ellie sold her first few pieces, hand-forged hinges, a horseshoe, and a new iron kettle she'd crafted from salvaged scraps. The coins jingled in her pocket, heavy and honest, as she loaded the wagon again to head home. She noticed a small figure standing near the edge of the square, a young boy clutching a worn wooden toy horse with one wheel missing. He hesitated, then shuffled forward. "Ma'am, could you fix this?" he asked softly. Ellie knelt, taking the toy gently. "Who made it for you?" "My pa. He passed last winter." Her heart tugged. The crack in the toy was clean, easy to mend. "I can fix it," she said. "Come by the forge tomorrow." "No charge?" The boy's eyes lit up. "Thank you, ma'am." As he ran off, Ellie caught sight of Martha Jenkins watching from her porch again, this time silent, her expression unreadable. Maybe, just maybe, even Martha saw the change. That evening, back on the ridge, the forge burned bright again. The rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil echoed across the hollow, the same sound that once marked life before loss, only now it belonged solely to Ellie. When the final ember dimmed, she stood beside the wagon once more, lantern in hand. Its shadow stretched long and proud across the clearing. For the first time in years, she felt peace. Not the quiet of defeat, but the calm of a life rebuilt by her own strength. She looked toward the stars through the pines and whispered, "We did it, Tom. Didn't fix the world, but fixed enough to start again." Daisy brayed softly from her stall, the night wind carrying the sound down into the hollow where, faintly, the town lights glimmered below, and though most of Pine Hollow would never admit it out loud, word would spread all the same. That mountain woman, the one they mocked for buying a broken wagon, had done the impossible. She'd turned ruin into rebirth, and in doing so, reminded the town of what could still be mended if they just believed something broken was still worth saving. Winter came early that year. Frost laced the pines, and the wind from the high ridge carried the sound of hammers ringing from Ellie Walker's forge. The glow of firelight pulsed against the dark mountain like a heartbeat. Steady, living, undeniable. Down in Pine Hollow, folks no longer laughed when they spoke her name. They spoke it with respect, sometimes with a tinge of shame. The same hands that once pointed and mocked were now bringing her their tools. Their pots, their broken pieces of life. Ellie never turned anyone away, every day. Smoke rose from her forge, and every night, the sound of hammer on metal echoed through the hills, a rhythm that even the old miners said brought comfort. Like the mountain itself was breathing again. It was a bitter morning when Sheriff Clyde Barrett came riding up her trail once more. The hooves of his horse crunched over frost-hardened clay, and steam curled from its nostrils. Ellie heard him before she saw him, that familiar jingle of spurs she'd once learned to dread. He dismounted near the forge, looking out over the clearing. The wagon stood nearby, covered in a thin layer of snow. The words Walker and Son Forge carved deep into its side. "Looks like you built yourself a whole new world up here," he said. His voice low, Ellie didn't look up from her work. She was shaping a horseshoe, the metal glowing orange beneath her hammer. "Not a new world, Sheriff," she said. "Just fixing the old one." Clyde took off his hat, rubbing the back of his neck. "You know, I never did apologize proper." She set the hammer down, the echo fading into silence. "For what?" she asked quietly. He hesitated. "For that night, the fire. Folks blamed your husband, said he was careless. But truth is, it was a spark from the line that runs through town. Faulty wire. I knew it, but the company paid me to keep quiet." The cold deepened between them. Ellie stared at him, her face unreadable. "You let him die with blame on his name," she said finally. Clyde nodded, shame heavy in his voice. "I did. Ain't slept right since." For a long time, Ellie said nothing. The fire popped in the forge, sending sparks into the air like restless ghosts. Then with a slow breath she picked up her hammer again. "You can't undo what's done, Sheriff," she said. "But you can carry it right. Maybe help build something better." He met her eyes, surprised. "You'd forgive me?" After all that, Ellie struck the iron again, the sound ringing clear through the frost. "Forgiving ain't forgetting. It's choosing not to stay buried with the ashes." Clyde stood there for a while longer, hat in hand, until finally he nodded. "Reckon the town could use a woman like you on the council. We're starting to build a new school come spring. It could use your kind of work ethic." Ellie smiled faintly, though her eyes stayed fixed on the glowing metal. "Let's see if the mountain agrees first." He chuckled softly, replaced his hat, and rode back down the trail, leaving only hoofprints and the fading echo of iron behind him. That night, snow began to fall. Big slow flakes drifted through the pine branches and settled over the wagon's wheels. Ellie stood outside her cabin, arms folded, watching the flakes settle on her husband's old initials carved in the wood. Inside, the forge's heat glowed from the open door, bathing the clearing in a soft orange light. She thought of the townsfolk who'd come by lately, Martha Jenkins bringing her broken stove grate and leaving with a humble thank you, the little boy from before, grinning as she handed him his mended toy horse, the miners who now stopped to lend her coal and share stories while she worked. The laughter that once haunted her had turned to kindness, and though grief still lived in her chest, it no longer ruled her hands. She walked to the wagon, brushed the snow from its side, and whispered, "Guess we made something worth keeping." "Tom!" The wind carried her words up through the trees, scattering them across the ridge. For a moment, the whole mountain seemed to listen. Then she turned back toward the forge, where the fire waited, eternal, bright, and alive. By spring, Walker & Son Forge wasn't just a place to mend tools. It had become the heart of Pine Hollow. Travelers from neighboring towns came to trade, and locals spoke of Miss Ellie as a woman of grit and grace, a soul who taught them that broken things could still hold beauty. If only someone believed they were worth the work. The wagon still stood at the edge of her clearing, its wood now silvered by weather, its iron fittings strong as the day she'd made them. Some nights, when the stars burned clear over the mountains, she'd sit by it with Daisy grazing nearby, her hammer resting at her feet, and she'd feel the peace of knowing that her story and Tom's had become something larger than loss. In time, the ridge came to be known as Walker's Rise, and though many winters passed, folks still told the tale of the mountain woman who bought a broken wagon, rebuilt it with her bare hands, and in doing so, rebuilt a whole town's heart. And on quiet nights, if you listen close enough, you can still hear the echo of her hammer in the wind, steady as a heartbeat, strong as iron, a reminder that nothing truly broken stays that way forever. The spring thaw came early to Pine Hollow that year, flooding the valleys and stirring the creeks awake. The snow that had buried the ridges melted into bright ribbons that danced down toward the town. On the slope once known as Old Timber Ridge, the forge still stood, weathered but unbroken, its chimney smoking faintly against the clear blue morning. It had been 30 years since Eleanor Walker first hauled that broken wagon up the mountain trail with her mule. Daisy, 30 years since folks in Pine Hollow called her crazy, since the sheriff threatened her with peace and quiet, since her hands first struck iron in the cold mountain air. Time had taken its toll on the town below, but the forge had endured, rebuilt, repaired, and passed on like a promise. Eleanor Walker had passed 15 winters ago, laid to rest beneath a small headstone behind her forge. The words carved there were simple. The wagon she'd once salvaged still stood under the pines, its wood silver-grey now, its wheels half swallowed by moss. The carved letters T.W., Thomas Walker's initials, were nearly worn smooth, but the forge behind it still roared to life most mornings, its anvil singing beneath the hands of a young woman who bore her great-grandmother's stubbornness like a badge. Her name was Clara. Walker Clara had hair the color of red clay and eyes that reflected every shade of the woods around her. Folks in Pine Hollow said she was the spitting image of her great-grandmother, same square jaw, same quiet fire in her gaze. At 26, she had taken over the forge, working iron just as Ellie had, slow, deliberate, never wasting a strike. When she swung her hammer, it was with rhythm and reverence, like she was keeping time with ghosts. But Pine Hollow was changing. The coal trains had stopped running years back. Timber companies had moved on, leaving empty shacks and hollow fields. Young men went west for work. Older folks stayed and talked about the old days, when smoke from the Walker Forge meant another tool fixed, another bit of life made better. Now, Clara's forge served a quieter purpose. She built art from scrap, wind chimes from old nails, bird sculptures from horseshoes, and iron roses that never wilted. Tourists came sometimes, snapping pictures of the Mountain Forge woman, but Clara wasn't chasing fame. She was chasing meaning, something she could never quite put into words. Every night, before locking up, she would walk to the wagon and run her fingers along the faded initials. It had become a ritual, one she'd never missed. "Great-grandma," she'd whisper softly. "I wonder if you ever felt lost." The forest never answered, but sometimes the wind through the pines sounded like a sigh. One evening, as golden light melted into dusk, a stranger came riding up the trail, a man in his late 30s, broad-shouldered, his clothes dusted from the long road. He dismounted near the forge, brushing snowmelt from his hat. "Evening, miss," he said, tipping it politely. "Name's Jack Barrett, sheriff's grandson. My granddad used to talk about this place." Clara straightened, surprise flickering in her eyes. "Barrett?" she repeated. "You mean Clyde Barrett?" He nodded, a hint of pride in his tone. "That's him. Spent most of his later years talking about a woman who taught him what right and wrong really looked like. Said she built this town back from its knees." Clara smiled faintly, unsure what to say. "Your granddad was part of that story, all right. My family's been hammering on his mistakes ever since." Jack chuckled softly. "Guess we both got legacies to mend then." He looked around the clearing, the old wagon, the forge glowing faintly behind her, the pines whispering in the evening breeze. "He used to tell me about that wagon," he said quietly. "Said it was the first thing he ever saw that made him believe in second chances." Clara turned toward it. The wood gleamed faintly in the fading light, the carving still visible beneath the moss. "It's more than a wagon," she said. "It's what started everything." Jack stepped closer, hands on his belt. "Mind if I see inside?" She hesitated. "Ain't much to see now. Just rotten memory. Sometimes that's enough." With a small nod, she led him to the wagon. Together, they brushed away the vines clinging to its frame. Inside, the boards were warped but intact. Beneath the floor, hidden by decades of dust, Clara's boots struck something hollow. "What in the—" She knelt, prying at a loose plank until it lifted with a soft creak. Inside lay a small, rusted tin box. Jack crouched beside her. "Looks like it's been there a while." Clara lifted it gently, her hands trembling. The lock had long since corroded. One twist of her knife popped it open. Inside were two objects, a folded letter yellowed with age, and a small iron pendant shaped like a horseshoe. Clara unfolded the letter. The ink faded but legible. The handwriting was delicate, firm, the same looping script she'd seen on old ledgers in the forge. "If you're reading this, then I've gone on ahead, and this wagon's had its say. I built my life on what folks threw away, and it gave me more peace than all their pity ever could. If you're kin, don't carry my sorrow, carry my stubbornness. The world will try to tell you what you can't fix. Show it what you can. The iron don't lie. It remembers every blow, every fire, every hand that shaped it. And if you're not kin but still found your way here, then maybe you were meant to. This forge wasn't built for me. It was built for whoever needed it next." Eleanor Walker. The letter trembled in Clara's hands. She read it twice, then pressed it to her chest, her throat tightening. Jack's voice broke the silence. "She wrote that before she passed?" Clara nodded. "Must have. Guess she hid it here, waiting for someone to listen." Jack smiled softly. "Looks like she's still teaching us both." Clara folded the letter carefully, placing it back into the box alongside the pendant. She always said the forge wasn't about money or pride. It was about mending what others gave up on. She glanced toward the dying light of the forge. Maybe it's time to open it up again, not just for me, but for everyone. A week later, word spread through Pine Hollow that the old Walker Forge would reopen as a workshop for apprentices. Young men and women from nearby towns came to learn how to shape iron, how to build, how to start again. Clara called it the Walker Workshop, and its motto, burned into a wooden sign above the door, read, "Nothing stays broken forever." Jack Barrett helped her run it, bringing supplies and helping restore the wagon to its former shape. When they pulled the last nail into place and rolled it onto new wheels, the whole town gathered to watch. The moment it moved forward, steady and sure, a cheer rose through the mountain air for the first time in years. Smoke and laughter drifted together over Pine Hollow. That summer, a group of school children from the new Pine Hollow Elementary came to visit the workshop. Clara stood before them, her hands blackened with soot, a soft smile playing on her lips. "You see this wagon?" she told them, tapping the smooth wooden side. "It belonged to a woman who lost everything and decided to build again. She didn't wait for someone to save her. She just started mending, one piece at a time." A little girl raised her hand. "Was she scared?" Clara thought about it, then nodded. "Every day. But she swung the hammer anyway. That's the part that mattered." The children gathered around the wagon, touching its old frame, tracing the faint initials, TW, with wide-eyed wonder. And Clara felt something lift in her chest. A quiet peace, the kind her great-grandmother must have felt that first night when the lantern burned low and the pines whispered her name. As dusk fell, Clara stood outside the forge with Jack beside her. Fireflies rose from the tall grass, blinking between the trees. The wagon gleamed faintly in the forge's glow, its iron trim warm as sunset. "You ever think she's still watching?" Jack asked softly. Clara smiled. "No," she said, gazing at the wagon. "I think she's resting." "She left her hammer with us," Jack nodded, tipping his hat. "Then we'd better not waste it." They stood there in silence, listening to the last embers crackle and fade. Down in the hollow, the town lights flickered on one by one, windows glowing like lanterns in the dark. Each one a little echo of her fire. The woman with the wagon was gone. But her story lived in every repaired hinge, every shaped horseshoe, every hand that dared to rebuild what others left behind. And when the mountain wind swept through Pine Hollow, it still carried the faint, rhythmic ring of hammer on iron, soft, steady, eternal, the heartbeat of Walker's legacy. By early spring, the mountain was stirring again. The last of the frost melted into soft rivulets that ran through the gullies like silver veins, and Ellie Walker could finally feel warmth on her cheeks when she stepped outside. The orchard she had planted from salvaged seeds was beginning to sprout tiny buds. Life, real, stubborn life, was clawing its way back from the dirt, same as her. She'd thought the whispers from the village might fade with winter, but they hadn't. If anything, they'd twisted into stories, half pity, half superstition. "That Walker woman," some said, "lives up there talking to ghosts and trees." Others said she'd gone mad, that the fire had taken more than her husband. It had taken her sense. But Ellie had stopped listening. The sound of the wind through the new buds meant more than their voices ever would. Still, she missed company sometimes. After the blizzard, Sheriff Cole had come by less often, though he'd send word through his nephew that he'd check in once the thaw settled. Ellie didn't mind. She'd learned to live quiet. But there were nights when she'd set the lantern beside her window and imagine another one glowing in the distance. A simple reminder she wasn't alone. One morning, she woke to the sound of hooves and the creak of a wagon wheel outside. It wasn't Cole. It was a stranger, thin, unshaven, eyes shadowed from the road. He introduced himself as Caleb Boone, a traveling trader from the next valley. His wagon was loaded with scrap tin and glass. He'd heard talk of a woman fixing wagons and building miracles out of broken things, and he wanted to see it for himself. Ellie almost laughed. "Ain't no miracles here," she said, hands on her apron. "Just work and stubbornness. Caleb smiled, showing the wear of his years. That's all miracles ever were. He stayed for coffee, and they talked about the ridge roads, the failing farms, the families moving down south to find mill work. When he left, he traded her a set of rusted plow blades for some jars of honey she'd been keeping. Before he went, he tipped his hat. "Folks down there think this mountain's cursed," he said. "Maybe they're just scared it remembers what they forgot." When his wagon disappeared down the trail, Ellie stood staring after it for a long while, those words turning circles in her head. That night, she dreamed of her husband again, not in flames this time, but sitting beside her in the orchard, carving the handle of a new plow. He looked younger, smiling, the way he had before the mine took his strength and the fire took everything else. When she woke, she could still smell the pine shavings and hear his humming. She went outside and sat beside the rebuilt wagon, running her fingers along the carved initials, JW. She'd never realized how much that wagon had come to mean to her. It wasn't just his memory anymore. It was proof that broken things could still carry life forward. The next week she took the wagon down to the village again, not to prove anything this time, just to trade goods. But when she rolled into town, conversation stopped as usual. Only this time the silence wasn't cruel. It was curious. Sheriff Cole met her at the square. "Ellie Walker," he said, half smiling, "you've caused quite the stir again." She raised an eyebrow. "What now?" "It seems a few of the men are looking to buy wagons off you. Heard yours rides smoother than the factory ones." Ellie laughed softly. "Tell 'em it's not for sale." "But I might build another." That was how it began. Word spread. One wagon became 3, then 5. Men who had once called her crazy were now coming to her for help, fixing their plows, wagons, and even roofs. They paid her in grain, firewood, or tools, whatever they could offer. Her little homestead became a place of barter, of quiet community. The same people who'd mocked her started to linger, sharing stories, trading seeds, mending fences. By midsummer, she'd built a small shed beside the cabin, a workshop of sorts, with shelves lined with oil tins, gears, and scraps of leather. The sound of her hammer on wood became part of the mountain's rhythm. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridge, Sheriff Cole returned, dust on his boots, hat in hand. "You've changed this place," he said, watching her hitch a new wheel to a frame. "Didn't think one wagon could do that." Ellie wiped her brow. "It wasn't the wagon," she said. "It was what it reminded them of, that we ain't done yet." Cole nodded, looking out at the horizon. "You ever think about leaving? Taking your work down to the city?" Ellie smiled faintly. "No, the city don't need another pair of hands. But this mountain, it needs heart," he didn't argue. Instead, he helped her carry a load of timber into the shed. As they worked, the light faded, and for the first time in a long while, Ellie realized she wasn't alone in her silence. That night, a storm rolled in from the west, soft rain at first, then a downpour. Ellie watched it from her porch, the wagon gleaming under the lightning. The orchard swayed, and she could almost hear the roots stretching deeper into the earth. Somewhere beneath those roots lay ashes, the remnants of her old life. But they had fed the soil, made it richer, stronger. And from that, new life had grown. When the rain eased, Ellie stepped barefoot into the mud, walked to the wagon and laid her palm on its wooden side. "Thank you," she whispered, not just to her husband, but to the mountain, the storms, the people who doubted her. Every one of them had shaped her into something unbreakable. From the road below, a faint lantern glowed, someone traveling late through the valley. Maybe another stranger, maybe a friend. Ellie didn't know, but she smiled, because the mountain that had once been silent now hummed with the sound of life returning. Tomorrow, she'd start on a new wagon, not because she needed it, but because building something from broken pieces had become her way of remembering and of forgiving. And as the dawn broke over the ridges, painting the mist gold, Ellie Walker, the woman the village once mocked, stood on her porch, watching her orchard bloom in the soft light. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The mountain knew her story now. It would remember, in late autumn, the valley below had changed as much as Ellie Walker's mountain. Fields once left fallow now rippled gold with late corn. Smoke rose from chimneys that had gone cold for years, and when people gathered in the square, their talk wasn't of failure or leaving. It was of repair, of trade, of staying. They called it the Wagon season, not because of any holiday, but because Ellie's rebuilt wagons had spread through the valley like seeds. Her name had become a quiet legend. Folks no longer said "that Walker woman" with suspicion. They said it with respect. But even as her work brought peace, Ellie felt a tremor in the air. Change, she'd learned, always came with a cost. One evening, a boy from the town came riding up her trail, shouting through the fog. His name was Matthew Ray, one of the miller's sons. His horse was foaming at the mouth, the boy's face pale. "Miss Walker!" he cried. "Fire!" The windmill caught. It spreading down the east ridge. Ellie froze for half a heartbeat. The smell of smoke in the wind slammed her back into a memory she thought she'd buried. The night her own home burned, her husband's shouts swallowed by flame. But she didn't have time to fall apart. She grabbed her coat, her lantern, and the bucket from the porch. "Tell Sheriff Cole I'm coming," she said. Her voice steady. The boy nodded and tore down the trail. Ellie hitched her wagon in the dark, loaded it with every bucket she owned, and drove toward the ridge. The horse stumbled through mud and roots, the wheels squealing, the air thick with smoke. As she reached the crest, she could see it, the fire crawling up the trees like a living thing, orange veins against the black night. Men and women were already there, forming a bucket line from the creek. Sheriff Cole stood at the center, shouting orders, face streaked with soot. When he saw Ellie's wagon roll in, he ran to her side. "Ellie, you shouldn't." She cut him off. "You need water, not warnings." He didn't argue. Together, they unhitched the horse, filled the barrels, and joined the fight. The fire roared and spat, lighting the night like a second sun. Sparks leapt across the line, igniting brush behind them. The heat was unbearable, but Ellie didn't stop. She moved as if possessed, throwing water, dragging buckets, shouting to others when they faltered. Hours passed. The fire moved slower now, beaten back inch by inch. But then came the wind, a hard gust from the west that sent the flames leaping toward the old mill. Coal. Ellie screamed over the roar. "If it takes the mill, it'll jump the creek." He turned, eyes wide. "We can't reach it in time." But Ellie was already moving. She climbed into her wagon, grabbed the reins, and snapped them hard. The horse bolted down the muddy slope straight toward the fire line. People shouted after her, but she didn't hear. The wagon rattled, wheels bouncing off stones, sparks raining from the sky. She aimed for the clearing near the mill, where the flames were lowest. When she reached it, she jerked the reins and overturned the wagon, spilling the water barrels into the grass. The water hissed and steamed, buying just enough time for Cole and the others to catch up. They tore the smoldering brush away, beating down what remained. When it was over, the forest was black and smoking, but the mill stood. Cole found Ellie sitting in the mud beside the wrecked wagon, her hands blistered and eyes dazed. He knelt beside her. "You could have died." Ellie looked up at the mill, then at the ruined wagon. Her first, the one she'd built with her husband's initials, still burned into the wood. "It did its job," she said softly. "Carried one more thing worth saving." Cole didn't speak. He helped her to her feet and led her away from the smoke as dawn broke over the ridge. The fire changed the valley. It burned a wide scar across the mountain, but it didn't destroy it. In the weeks that followed, townsfolk rebuilt what was lost. Ellie's wagon lay in the ashes by the creek, too damaged to repair, but she didn't grieve it. She'd learned something that night. Even the things you build to last eventually have to fall, to make room for what comes next. Cole visited often now. Sometimes he brought supplies. Sometimes he just sat on the porch, drinking coffee, while the orchard shimmered gold behind them. They didn't talk much about the fire. They didn't have to. One evening, as the sun set over the ridge, he said quietly, "You ever think about building another wagon?" Ellie smiled, looking at the orchard where the young trees were now bearing fruit. "No," she said, "but I've been thinking of something else." She gestured to the slope below her cabin, where the earth had been cleared. "A workshop, not just for me, for anyone up here who wants to learn. There's more hands than hope in this valley. Maybe it's time that changed." Cole nodded slowly. You teach 'em? I teach 'em what I can, she said. How to fix what's broken, how to build again. He watched her for a long moment, then smiled. You're something, Ellie Walker. You know that? She laughed softly. So I've been told. As twilight deepened, the two sat in silence, watching the lights of the valley flicker on below, small, stubborn fires that refused to die out. And up on the mountain, the woman who had once been mocked for buying a broken wagon now planned to rebuild an entire way of life. One nail, one hand, one heart at a time. The mountain had burned, but it had also remembered. And so had she. Winter rolled over Pine Hollow quietly, as if even the wind had grown tired of gossip. Snow gathered on the ridge, muffling the world in a kind of peace Ellie Walker had never known before. Her orchard stood bare but proud, the trees skeletal against a pale horizon. Each morning she walked between them, checking bark and root, humming as if to remind them spring would return. The workshop she'd planned now stood half-finished beside the cabin. Its beams were cut from pine, its roof still open to the grey sky. Inside, the scent of sawdust lingered thick, mixed with oil and smoke. Ellie had spent long nights here alone, shaping tools, mending wagon wheels for others, and teaching the few who dared the climb. 3 of them came regularly: Matthew Ray, the miller's boy who'd warned her of the fire; Clara Thompson, a young widow from the town; and Joseph Boone, a quiet man with hands too soft for the axe, but a heart steady as riverstone. Together they learned, fumbling at first, then growing confident beneath Ellie's patient guidance. Doesn't need to be perfect, she'd tell them, her tone even as her hands corrected their grip. Just strong enough to carry weight. That's all a thing needs to matter. Her words became a kind of creed among them. One evening, a storm crept through the valley, sleet and thunder rolling like the voice of something ancient. The others had gone home, leaving Ellie to close up the workshop. As she gathered her tools, a knock rattled her door. Sheriff Cole stepped inside, his coat dusted with snow.